probably, looking even at the fellow grey heads around the place, I'm one of the oldest residents, having been brought up here. And so I thought it might be appropriate to talk a little bit about, very briefly, what it was like here in the 1950s. So this building was here, and this was where we came for school concerts. School went through at Ngaio School till Standard 6, so nobody left the suburb, basically, until they went to college. So this was an important place, particularly on Saturday afternoons, because the flicks were here. It cost threepence and sixpence to come to the flicks, and we were allowed to come in the winter. There was a man with a torch. I don't recall a lot of trouble. At one point, somebody rolled jaffas along the floor, but you know, we didn't have much money in those days. We'd had to take lemonade bottles back to the store up there to get pocket money, so I don't think we would have wasted it buying jaffas and rolling them down the floor. But opposite where the tennis court now is was just pine trees and the creek. So there was no tennis court. There was no road other than the farm road that went through to what we now know as Crofton Downs, and of course further on was Churchill Drive. So if you were going into the city, you went via the Ngaio Gorge. There wasn't a lot of traffic in the 1950s because we used to ride our trikes, no, sorry, not our trikes, our trolleys, down Kenya Street from the top, because we've got a good run down there with one at the bottom saying, watch out, there's a car coming, if it was coming this way, and one at the top to say you can go. So we would come cruising down Kenya Street past Margaret Demet's place at great speed on our trolleys to get to the bottom. That's how few cars were around. We lived in Kenya Street, and our section went right down to the Korimako. So our playground was the stream. Our wider playground was the farm, Kilmister's farm at the end of Crofton Road. Our hiking, or our sort of bigger experiences, were at Crow's Nest and occasionally round the tops, but it was mainly up to Crow's Nest and the bush. So the bush, the farm, the stream, we were really passionate about, and as 1950s kids, prior to TV, we were outdoors most of the time. As I say, our section went down to the stream from Kenya Street there, just by the Waikawai Street Bridge. When there was a new baby arrived in the house, my parents had to look for another house for more bedroom space. And we, for a couple of years, used to trek along the road on Sunday afternoons to look at this new suburb they were going to open up called Crofton Downs. The job of we children was to stand on the surveyor's pegs at the various lots and work out. My mother was paranoid about where the sun was going to hit the house because we came from a very sunny site. She was a little bit anxious about this new place. So we would stand on the pegs, and we would sometimes go at 11 o'clock in the morning, sometimes at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But it was to just check out where the sun was moving. And in the end, they didn't buy a section over there. We knew the area well from the farm. It was a working farm. We actually had top-dressing planes flying overhead, top-dressing the slopes, sheep, cattle, sheep trucks going, taking wool bales off, all sorts of, really farmy things. And they bought a section which was subdivided in Perth Street and built there. So my secondary schooling time was living in Perth Street. But I just wanted to say that this was always a very strong community. And by that I mean, not only was the Progressive Association in existence, because this is my other connection, and the reason for really saying this was that my father was on the Progressive Association in the 1950s, and I remember going and taking the scones for the morning teas for the plantings that they had back then. They planted all that bush. I remember them doing it, up to the Ngaio station. Sid Odell was the chairman, so Odell's Reserve, planting up at the reservoir. his daughter was in my class at school, we were good friends. As I say, a strong community that looked probably more inwards than outwards, and very protective of our bush. And that's something that I think you're going to find when I talk to you about one or two things that we did. That's continued right through. I've actually got a real estate sign from back in the 1940s which said, "Buy in Ngaio, the forest suburb." And if Judy had been here, I'm sure she would have talked about, you know, the early days of this being raised really by the early settlers to get the trees, which they took off up Crofton Road and down the Ngaio Gorge there, the old Porou Road, to the city. It grew really good trees. And whilst Ngaio as such is actually a word that means something like reflections in the water, I actually think the word Ngaio was given to the suburb after the tree, the Ngaio tree that grows here so prolifically. So the community was tight, the community was inward looking, very protective of the bush and the natural environment, and as I say, we didn't go out of it much, there was no need to. Life revolved around the school. The library was this little thing here. Mrs. Rees was the imperious librarian in there, and she ruled. We all lined up and got our books in there and then went out the other door. The school and the churches. The churches were very strong. There was the Methodist church at the bottom of Crofton Road, there, the little old wooden one, which had a very good Bible class that brought in a lot of young people. The Anglican church, the Catholic church up in Natota Street, the Presbyterians up in the village there. So at school, you talked about Bible class or Sunday school or whatever. Church was big, school was big, and you stayed at school until you went to college. And then Onslow College opened up, I think the first year was 1957. 56, was it? 56 or 57 was the first year. Yeah, was the first year of Onslow College, and so kids went that way as well as into town. We never went to town. My mother wouldn't have taken 4 kids to town if you'd paid her to, but she went when we went to school to do the shopping. So it was a very strong community. I can see lots of old faces here of people that I remember back from that time, and I think you would agree with me, Nikki, wouldn't you? It was community focused and always has been. There were issues, for example, about the roundabout at Awarua Street. There was a big fuss about that at the time. There was a big fuss about BP wanting to put a big hyper supermarket-y petrol station up here in place of where the gas pump is now, a big thing. In fact, the people in the surrounding areas, I think, actually went to court over that one. We didn't as an association, but there was a lot of concern about that. It was bright lights and loud music, and, you know, it was sort of not Ngaio. It was going to sort of make us too commercial or something or other, but there was that issue. There was a big fuss about satin cables overhead. I was just talking before there with Debbie. There was concern about the church wanted to put a cell phone tower on the tower there, and her group got started with concerns about that. Didn't go to court, did it? No, it went to council, yeah, permissions for that. But I need to mention some of the things that we did, I say for ourselves, it wasn't so much for ourselves, but with the funnier things. One was the institution of the junk drives. Now, everybody looks back with great fondness at the junk drives. This was before the days of ultra safety. So we would have the trucks on a Saturday in the middle of winter, and we would hop on the back and drive all around the suburb, picking up what people couldn't take to the tip. And there was always a good morning tea, and it was always great fun. Kids helped, the Scouts got involved at one stage too as a fundraiser thing for them. It was good fun until somebody decided that it was necessary to have high-vis jackets, to have safety checks, to have nobody standing on the back of a truck and all sitting in the cab, and the whole thing went flat. But it did continue for about 15 years, I'd say, and sort of was one of the highlights of the year, the junk drive. In fact, I've still got one of my favourite pieces of pottery and gets dragged out at the dinner table as a nice 1950s pottery jug that somebody put out on the side of the road, and I thought that's absolutely fantastic, and I still use it to this day, and it's often admired. Julia and Debbie got at one stage when we realised a lot of people were sort of thinking, aha, here's the chance to get Grandma's house sorted out, and would put out things that were really good. They started stopping the trucks when they went up past, because they were going to Porirua, going up Kandala Road, they would stop the trucks and they would sniff around and take the things that were saleable or could be repurposed very easily, and there was a little stall and stand, and we raised a bit of money on the side of the road at Kandala up there as well. So it was a good service for people, but it had to stop because everybody got a bit precious about things. There were never, to my knowledge, any accidents whatsoever. But I'd just like to read you a couple of things that Julia sent me this morning when she realised she couldn't come because of her cold. She said, I would like to mention the note that came home from my child's teacher at Ngaio school. She sent me the description of myself and my husband. This is what her child had written. My mum goes to the Ngaio Aggressive Association, and my father and my dad goes to self-defence. Because Steve was involved in civil defence and protection of the environment, concern about safety and people having access to things, bringing people together and making sure that we all feel that sense of community which has always been so strong here. Thank you.